Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 22nd of November of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. First we're going to talk about Kherson direction. The Russians are saying that as a result of clashes on this area, the Ukrainians lost 70 soldiers and 5 armored vehicles. The level of losses when talking about this direction is very heavy, and the main clashes are taking place in the villages like Krynki, and as a result of Russian bombardments of the cities like Berislav, Kazatsky, Tyaginka, Lvova, Mykolaiivka, and so on. But anyway, the main clashes are taking place in Krynki. The Russians continued their offensive and storming operation of this territory, but the Russians are trying to act very slow, and they're not trying to risk. They don't want to risk because, as I understand, the Russians took a decision to use the tactics of blockade. They understand that the Ukrainians has some limitations in their support and supply, and the only possible solution how the Ukrainians can get ammo, weapon, medicine, and many other important things for a normal defense can come just from the Ukrainian bank of the river. And for these purposes, the Ukrainians need to create logistic, and the only transport equipment they can use is just the regular boats. And the Russians understand, if they are able to destroy the boats, if the Russians are able to establish fire, drone, any type of control over the Dnieper River, then the Ukrainians basically will starve and die on the Russian bank of the river. There are going to be no chances for them. And from one side, of course, these tactics need some time, like to establish blockade. This is the first thing. The second thing is that the blockade is something that should be established 24 hours, 7 days a week. You can't have blockade, let's say, in the morning, and there is no blockade during the night period of time. And when talking about the previous months, previous days of the clashes for Krynki, the Russians didn't have such possibilities like establishing blockade and fire control over the Dnieper River during the night period of time. But recently we've discussed that the Russians have improved their FPV drones, their Lancet drones with night vision equipment, and now there are no barriers and problems for the Russians to destroy everything that goes along Dnieper River with FPV, with any type of drone strikes. And not just drone strikes, but also with Lemur missiles. For example, on this video we see the Ukrainians who were moving from one building to another in Krynki. The Russians discovered these positions, they sent coordinates to their, let's say, air forces, and the Russian helicopters Mi-24 launched the self-navigated missile Lemur, and as a result of strike, Ukrainian stronghold or fortification or just a small building checkpoint was destroyed. But one more time, to establish 100% blockade, the Russians need to establish control over the Dnieper River. And I'm talking about this part of Dnieper River. Take a look at this map, because this is the main logistic square that Ukrainians use for the deployment of their forces. And just during the previous 24 hours, we received significant number of videos saying that the Russians do have control, and furthermore, the Russians do have the fire control during the night period of time. And this is most important. And not just the situation that the Russians control Dnieper from now on during the night period of time. The most important is that Ukrainians didn't expect that. They thought, and probably some squads, some platoons, some brigades still think that, I'm talking about the Ukrainians, that they can control the Dnieper River during the night period of time. For example, on this video we see how relaxed Ukrainians brought at least 4 boats in this part of Dnipro to the south, another 5 boats, even 6 boats. So we see around a little bit less than 15 boats were on the Ukrainian bank of the river. The Ukrainians were very slow. That was a night period of time. They start concentration forces and loading their ammo to the boats. The Russians discovered that situation during the night period of time and destroyed the Ukrainian positions with Lancet strike. So the Ukrainians didn't expect, and at least the previous 48 hours and the next probably 48 hours, the Ukrainians will have significant losses as a result of strikes of Russian drones, because they need to send forces, they need to send food, supply, ammo, medicine to evacuate wounded, but now they can't do this because the Russians do have solution how to destroy the Ukrainians during the night period of time. They need some time, the Ukrainians, to solve this issue, and something tells me that there are no solutions solution for this issue. And for example, on this video we see another Ukrainian group who just arrived to the Ukrainian bank of the river. They started regrouping, like they started unpacking their cars with ammo, with support, with supply. It's a very long process. We see one group of Ukrainians on the bottom of this video who were moving to the boats without even any idea, any thoughts in their minds that the Russians control the situation, that the Russians are able to see them. And at some moment of all this process, the Russians launched significant number of missiles, very deadly missiles, and as a result of those strikes, the Ukrainians lost the entire squad. The strike was made by probably Lancet. First strike got into the car. We see lots of wounded and killed people around this funnel of explosion. And basically the operation was cancelled due to this fact. So this is the plans of the Russians to blockade and to starve the Ukrainian forces on this bank of the river. When talking about other front lines, we have some updates not just about the geolocations and so on. We also have some updates regarding the redeployment of the forces. Now we have some understanding where we can find this or that brigade of the Ukrainian forces on the Russian bank of the river. For example, when talking about the Ukrainian presence in Krynki, there are mainly 35th Brigade and 36th Brigade of Ukrainian Marine Forces. And when talking about the area between, let's say, Dachi, Pridniprovska and Sadovo on this side of Dnieper River, there are 38th Marine Brigade and 37th and some parts of 36th Brigade. Anyway, the Ukrainians still haven't managed to advance, to develop. They're having losses, and the Russians basically stabilized the situation and control the entire process on this, let's say, front line. Now we're moving to Zaporizhzhia area, and we also got some updates. According to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, the level of losses of the Ukrainian side on this area were around 60 soldiers and 4 armored vehicles. So this is not, those losses weren't so heavy. It's just normal, just maybe even regular day without any activity, just artillery duels, small, maybe few from both sides, reconnaissance in force or in combat. On this video we see some Ukrainian soldiers who were moving around the fields. The Russians were bombing them, and we have just 3 videos along this line. Two videos took place on the line between Robotin and Novoprokopovka. On this video there we can find a lot of dead bodies of the Ukrainian forces. On the, let's say, eastern flank between Robotin and Verbova, we have the video of Ukrainians in the fields, like lots of armored vehicles. The Russians were bombing them and attacking them. Some of the armored vehicles were abandoned by the Ukrainians and just left on the fields, like this tank T-64. So as I understand, based on these geolocations, the Ukrainians try to make something like a test or trainings, like exercises, military exercises, trying to attack and to check the Russian possibilities using broad front line, reconnaissance in force or in combat, like operational doctrine. They were attacking all over along this line. They were repelled, and as a result of that, the Ukrainians were forced to step back. So there are very high chances that during the next few days the Ukrainians will restart, but with more, with a bigger army and more forces. Now we're moving to Donetsk direction. We will bypass South Donetsk because we haven't received anything from this area, just the mappers update about the capturing of this stronghold of the Ukrainian forces. But when talking about Donetsk, we have significant number of updates, and all of them are very interesting, very interesting. This morning we got updates, we got information from the Russian side that the Russians launched a very heavy artillery preparation, artillery bombardment of Avdiivka. The Russians were using all types of weapon they have, including new type of weapon the Russians start using recently, and I'm talking about the cluster bombs RBK500. The Russians, by the way, start using this type of weapon massively. First we received just the text messages, text updates, but later during the day we got at least 2 or 3 geolocated confirmations. On this video, on the west of Avdiivka, we see the first usage of this type of cluster rounds, RBK500. So So we see that the Russians are bombing the Ukrainian fortifications and trenches heavily, and the most important that this is another case of a military, let's say, unexpected decision. The same story as we saw as we discussed a minute ago in Krynki and the Kherson area. The Russians started unexpectedly the usage of FPV drones with night vision, and the Ukrainians weren't and still aren't prepared for this situation. When talking about Avdiivka, the Ukrainians just get used to Russian tanks, armored vehicles attacks, and so on, and now the Russians are forced to face the cluster rounds bombardments, and the Ukrainians are not ready to this situation. They don't know what to do this, and obviously this short timing will allow the Russians maybe even to achieve significant results. But anyway, based on the geolocations of Russian bombardment with cluster rounds, we see the main purpose and the main Russian focus. And currently the main Russian focus lays in this area. I will mark this on map. So this is currently the main Russian focus of the usage of RBK500 like say bombing. So that means that there are very high chances that within the next few days or hours the Russians may try to make reconnaissance in force in direction of the road between Severna and Avdiivka, and another attack from opposite direction of the Avdiivka block by the name of Khimik. There are very high chances just due to the usage of this type of cluster rounds RBK500. When talking about the northern direction of the chemical plant, we haven't received anything from this area. The only update we got is the photo of Russian soldier with Bradley. So the sources are saying that as a result of clashes in the vicinity of Stepova or Petrovska, when talking about the Russian the Russian description, the Russian title of this village, the Russians managed to capture and to evacuate the Ukrainian Bradley that was destroyed or not destroyed but damaged and abandoned along the railways. So as you can see, the Bradley is completely correct. Obviously the Russians will evacuate. You know that obviously sooner or later we're gonna see on the combat line the usage of the Western machines against the Western countries, because for now we've seen just like a lot of old Soviet tanks, T-72, 64. Sometimes the Ukrainians during the previous phase of the war managed to capture, let's say, like T-90, and the Ukrainians, of course, because they know and familiar with the Soviet equipment, were fighting with the Russians basically with Russian weapon. And I wonder whether the Russians ever plans to start using Bradleys against the Western countries. Obviously, this might be a fantastic scene, like not just to show the Ukrainians that the Russians also can do this, but even for Western media to show the Western weapon, like Bradleys, like Leopards or Challengers, fighting against the Western weapon. Obviously, this must be another media shock for the Western countries that will also reduce their expectation and about any type of finance and investments into Ukraine. But the most important updates are coming from the southern direction, from industrial area. Today the Russians shared with us with a lot of footages and scenes from this part of Avdiivka. For example, on this video we see like more scenes and episodes of clashes inside of the industrial area. These clashes took place not today, not even yesterday. These clashes took place maybe 2 or 3 days ago, but we're using this video to show them to understand the real Russian and Ukrainian positions. And based on that video, the Russians managed to establish control for over 90% of industrial area, and furthermore, we will discuss this in a minute, the Russians managed to establish control over the residential area that located on the bottom below this industrial area. On this video we see just the Russian supply troops, supply squad, supply platoon that were trying to bring generator to the combat line for the Russian forces on the zero line, for example, maybe to charge phones or maybe to charge FPV drones, because FPV drones needed to be always have possibilities to be charged always to fly above the Russian positions. Anyway, this video was geolocated, and according to the Russians, this event took place exactly in this area, which confirms that the Russians control for more than 90% of this territory. But that was not the most important video. The most important video came today from the southern part, from the residential area, from the, let's say, residential area by the name of Vinogradnik. This is something like the place where people have their private houses, where they were able to have some gardens, some trees, some apples, I don't know. And if you remember, I would like to remind you that on the 3rd of November, we had a very interesting video from this direction. If you remember, we discussed that the Russians managed to create a tunnel below the Ukrainian fortifications. The length of the tunnel was around 170 meters, and basically they created the tunnel below the Ukrainian positions, and when they got to some point, they blown up the Ukrainian fortifications and strongholds, and that was the only video we have from this position. Let's take a look at this video one more time. And this is the process of the building of these tunnels, and this is the explosion. And after that, we haven't received anything from this direction, and we don't know what exactly happens later. But I know, and I remember for sure that the real progress and the real developments the Russians got after that explosion. We haven't received like more details, but most of the area in industrial area was captured right exactly after that explosion. And today the Russians shared with us the big footage, the big scene, the big video of clashes on this area. Let's take a look at this video one more time. We see, we remember this explosion below the Ukrainian fortification. And the most important, as we discussed, the Russians managed to build a tunnel, and after that explosion, the Russians start sending troopers and assault forces, maybe even Wagner forces, maybe Akhmat forces, through the tunnel right behind the Ukrainian, let's say, edge positions. And after that, of course, there was a panic. The Ukrainians were shocked because they didn't expect the appearance of the Russians behind them. As you can see, the Russians were sending like dozens and maybe even hundreds of soldiers to the Ukrainian positions. The Ukrainians obviously weren't prepared to meet them in front of them, knowing that behind the Russians there are still Ukrainian positions. And basically, as a result of that storm tunnel attack, the Russians managed to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt and basically to collapse the most fortified area in entire special military operation zone. These buildings, like this residential area that we see right now the Russians are storming, is the most fortified area in the entire special military operation zone. This area even more fortified than the Russian fortifications, like the line of Surovikin, the line that we saw in Robotyne. And the Russians found a solution how to trick the Ukrainians, and they won the battle. So basically, based on this video, based on these geolocations, I understand that this map that you can see right now in front of your screens is not correct. And obviously this territory is in the gray zone, at least should be colored within the gray zone, because I will tell you more. Due to this video of the storm operation in the residential area, there are very high chances that the Russians managed to establish full control over this territory, and the real operation of capturing the industrial zone started even exactly from this territory. We got used to think that the Russians started their movement along this street, trying to storm the Ukrainian positions and so on. But now, as I understand, first the Russians captured this territory by that tunnel explosion and tunnel assault operation. They managed to get here. The Russians managed to establish fire or physical control over the main supply roads that went in direction of the Ukrainian positions in industrial area. Basically, the Russians have created a cauldron for Ukrainians in industrial zone, and after that, the main Russian forces started movements from the southeast to the northwest in this area and destroyed every single Ukrainian on this direction. So that was the operation. And you know that if someday somebody will ask you how the Russians managed to establish control over Avdiivka, If at least if you ask my opinion, and if somebody will ask me, I would tell that the Russians managed to capture Avdiivka because of the tunnels that they built below the Ukrainian fortifications in the southern industrial area. Just based on this, I know, Trojan horse or something like this, we can call it whatever. Anyway, Avdiivka south fortification has been collapsed and as a result of Russian trick, Russian smart attack, and so on. Obviously, the next days we're going to receive more updates from this area, and the Russians will continue their offensive operation further inside of this fortification area. The total losses of the Ukrainians on Avdiivka direction were around 115 for armored vehicles and 1 artillery system. Also very interesting numbers: during the previous 24 hours, according to the Russians, the Ukrainians lost just 1 artillery system. So the level of clashes was very low. But today, as we know, the Russians restarted their offensive operation. So tomorrow I expect at least a bigger number, maybe some even advances in progress of the Russians all over the combat line. When talking about Klishchevka, Andreevka, Kurdyumovka, the main clashes in this area are taking place for the area along the railways from Zelenopolye to Andreevka. As I understand, currently these territories are in the gray zone, and nobody controls this territory, neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians. And just let's say in the morning the Russians control this territory, but during the evening counterattack, the Ukrainians are able to force the Russians to step back and to establish their personal control. Both sides use FPV drones massively. They're bombing and attacking each other, infantry, soldiers, fortifications, and so on. And the Russians are doing the same. So the clash is continuous. When talking about other front lines of Bakhmut direction, like Yagidne, Berkhovka, Bogdanovka, we haven't received anything from this direction. When talking about Kupiansk and Liman, as you can see, there are no geolocations, no updates, so very difficult to understand what is going on. We have just the numbers that Ukrainians lost 65 and 50 soldiers on Liman and Kupiansk directions, and the only geolocation we have from Sinkovka is how the Ukrainian tank was attacking the Russian forces in front of him. Let's say the Ukrainian tank was on the line of Sinkovka and he was attacking the Russian positions in front of himself. So we are using this video just to geolocate and to confirm, let's say, the Ukrainians, either the Ukrainians and the Russian positions on this direction. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.